these systems within us are so resilient and amazing that when we're young and more vulnerable, we're having these wounds, these parts within us that are, becoming wounded because of these various complex traumatic, stressful events. And then we have these protector parts that, take on these roles in order to help the system not feel overwhelmed, by those various wounds, those feelings, those sensations, those beliefs, all of that. And those protector parts then become a big part of who we are and how we live our life. We'll make it out and fall in love tonight.
On today's episode, we have Natalie Deering, a licensed mental health therapist who specializes in working with people with complex trauma and anxiety using internal family systems therapy. It's also known as IFS. Natalie is also the host and producer of That Wellness podcast with Natalie Deering, Internal Family Systems with a Twist. Natalie, welcome. We're excited to talk with you today.
Thank you both so much for having me on. I'm really excited.
Yeah, we're super excited to get into this. I know that we've been chatting via email a little bit, but IFS is one of those things that it's been, I don't even know, babe, what do you think? 4, 5, 6 years ago when it kind of came into our space?
Something like that, yeah.
We went through a big round of, that makes it sound funny, but it's kind of what it was. We went through a big round of healing where we actually lucked out and found some therapists that were super cool, super helpful. They worked in conjunction with each other and helped both of us navigate, truthfully, the biggest healing event of our entire life. But they definitely incorporated IFS into that. And so it's a thing that we're very familiar with. It's something that we use in our relationship and kind of how we continually process and work and go through things together. So we're excited to talk to you about it. Yeah. But I think a great place to start off with would be just breaking it down and explaining it as best as you can for those people that might not be familiar with it.
Yeah. Well, number one, I think it's really amazing that the two of you were able to find, a group of healers that were utilizing IFS or even just parts work, because I think it's becoming more and more popular now over the past couple years. The IFS community and the interest in IFS has kind of exploded, but it's been around for, I think, 40 years when Dick Schwartz first created it.
Is it that long?
I didn't know.
Yeah. I think this year or last year was like the 40th anniversary.
That's awesome.
Wow.
Yeah, the creation of it. And and Dick will say it's been an evolving process, of course, over the past 40 years, where it's not like he just created it from start to finish 40 years ago and then it has never changed. He very much acknowledges it's been a team effort from a variety of other people that he, connected with over those earlier years, which has helped bring different elements to what is IFS, which is really neat. I love that about it. But yeah, I think it's wonderful that the two of you were able to find IFS and that you're able to find it to be helpful in your healing work individually, but also together. It sounds like, I think that's really beautiful. But yeah, IFS, I always take a moment. I present on this a lot. I love going to conferences and talking about IFS. And there, parts of me are so excited about IFS that at first my mind just kind of goes because there's just so much to share. First thing I always like to say about it is it's based on this understanding that we're all multiple, that we're not just these kind of just solo beings that, I just think like this and this is all of who I am. I mean, when you really get curious and turn in, you'll start to notice all of these different aspects of ourselves, these different parts of ourselves. And I always like to say to people when they first come to me who have never heard of parts work or IFS, I bet you use the word part already. You're just not maybe aware of it in this context. So I feel like most people will say, a part of me really wants to maybe go for a walk, but another part of me wants to hang on the couch and watch Netflix, And so again, it's just this acknowledgement already that there is this multiplicity within us that hold different opinions that hold different emotions, that hold different body sensations, experiences. And that's pretty amazing in my opinion, that we can look at ourselves and get curious in terms of getting to know all of these different parts that make up who we are. So that's the first thing that I like to share, with people about IFS, is that we're all multiple. And I feel like society sometimes, or at least I feel like through some movies or television shows, they have a history of kind of showcasing multiplicity of the mind as something bizarre or scary, weird, you're crazy, and so that's something I will hear from some people when they come to me to work in therapy, is when I
That's
introduce.
totally, I'm so glad you bring it up, because that's totally what I first initially thought.
Yeah.
Like when they started working, like my therapist specifically, because we worked individually with each therapist, and then our therapists did some joint sessions with both of us as well. But when we would work with it, when he started talking about it, I'm like, he was explaining it to me and I'm trying to understand it. And you're very like spot on, because it is so common, right? A part of me feels this way. A part of me thinks this way. A part of me wants this. And another part of me wants that. But initially I was like, man, it's a slippery slope, because I have a part of me that totally feels like I'm crazy.
Right.
And that part hears this information as proof. See, you're fucking crazy. I knew that you were crazy. This is just proving that you're crazy and that you're definitely on that spectrum of, because I know that it used to be multiple personality disorder, but now what do they call it? There's some other new name for what that is. I think I can't remember what it is.
There's
Dissociative.
dissociative identity disorder.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I'm glad you bring it up, because I do think that I know that that was the case for me, that when I first started learning about it and hearing about it.
I want to jump on that as well, because that is like a really big thing that I think people can hear and lean into. I didn't have it right off the bat as thinking that I was crazy. What happened is, like, my therapist, who's amazing, walked me through this process, and so much happened. I'll let you get into it, but the transformation that takes place, and I was talking to these parts and seeing, and then she was talking about the table, because I had other parts that wanted to jump in and protect. And after we got through this really big, like, emotion, I don't even know how to describe it right now, this really unity, integration point. And I looked at her and realized it was just her and me. Suddenly all these pieces were gone, and I'm like, oh, I've lost my mind. I was literally having conversations with all of the, I'm crazy. And she's like, honey, no, I promise everybody has that. So that's a real thing that comes up that can really scare people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so often I will have someone that I'm working with make a comment like that, of they'll experience a taste of it and they'll pop out, out of it, and then they'll be like, this is bizarre, but in a cool way, and I didn't know that that all those parts were in there. And it is, because again, we're not taught, at least in America, which is where I'm born and raised and where I've lived my entire life. Like, I don't feel like that's part of our culture, is looking at ourselves in these multiple ways. It's very individualistic and kind of siloed. And so then, yeah, as we turn inwards and we start to come across all these different parts, like, they're coming forward and they're sitting at a table with you, and that a part could be like, oh my God, this is so strange. Is this okay? Is this normal? And yeah, it can be a shock to the system of like, oh, wow, yes, this is just a bunch of different parts of who I am. And one part doesn't make up my identity, which can also feel really weird, especially if a specific part of us has been kind of like driving the bus, as I like to say, for the majority, let's say, of our life, whether starting in childhood and it just kept going. It can be, yeah, this kind of like, whoa, oh, I always just thought that was me. And then it's this shift to, oh, this is a part of me, but it's not all of who I am. And that can be, yeah, it can bring up a bunch of different things.
What first appealed to you? Like, when did you first start working with it, and what was the draw to start working with IFS in this way?
Yeah. So I had been a therapist already for 8 years before I even heard about IFS. And a part of me is jealous of these newer therapists that are in graduate school and they're being taught IFS in graduate school, because it was not something ever mentioned as far as I remember. And so, yeah, I was a practicing therapist, seeing clients. I was doing a lot more of, kind of like traditional talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. I was really interested and still into, using meditation. I got yoga teacher, trained. So I loved incorporating mindfulness techniques and somatic practices and things like that into the talk therapy work. And when I was in yoga teacher training is when the teacher started talking one day about IFS. And I remember I was kind of like, oh, that's interesting. But it was kind of one of those moments where I think it just like planted a little seed, but then it kind of just stayed as a seed. And then I started doing a private practice like on the side of my full-time job at the time as a therapist working at a university. And one of the clients I started working with in my private practice came to session one day, and they had a workbook in hand, a complex PTSD workbook. And they said, I found this workbook online. I've been looking through it. And here's this page. And they're talking about this thing called IFS. And I was like, that sounds kind of familiar. And I said, well, and I bought the workbook. I read the page. And I think it was that moment that seed started to grow. And from that point forward, I just dove down the rabbit hole in the IFS way. I started taking as many trainings as I could that were available besides the actual like full-on IFS training at the time. So for a number of years, I was reading all the books. I was taking all the trainings that you can as a provider of mental health and wellness, like that you pay for online. And then eventually I was like, you know what? I think it's time. I'm ready to see if I can get into a level 1, because there's 3 different levels in IFS, level 1, level 2, level 3, in terms of their trainings. And because it's exploded recently in popularity, it's extremely difficult to get into a training. I mean, it takes people years because they have a wait list to get on the wait list. And I'm not joking.
Oh, wow.
It's a wait list to get on the wait list. And then if you get picked from the second wait list, then you can apply to see if you can even get in. I mean, it's bonkers right now, which is amazing. It's so amazing, but it can be frustrating for a lot of providers right now who are wanting to get officially trained and they're having a hard time getting in. So I was able to get into a level 1, did that, and then was very fortunate to get accepted into a level 2 training taught directly by Dick, who invented the model, which is very rare. It was through Cambridge, and it was just great. And it was focusing on anxiety, depression, shame, and they threw grief in there too. But yeah, so at level 2 got to be trained by Dick, and I've just over the past, I guess it's been 4 or 5 years, so maybe it like sounds the same as you all. It's just been this process for me of soaking in IFS, using it every day of my life, and both in my personal life and with my clients, and also learning to incorporate and weave in the things that I was doing before I knew about IFS as well. So learning how to incorporate, the somatic work as well, and the meditation and the mindfulness, and that all those things can weave together, and how it can be a really beautiful experience. So that's been my experience, getting into IFS in a nutshell.
One of the things that, thank you for explaining it and kind of breaking it down a little bit and sharing your story with it. One of the things that always confuses me when I think about it, and truthfully, there's a part of me that is often confused by like I'll get hung up on certain things, and then like my brain has to confront that thing first before I can even go on to the next thing. And one of the things with IFS that I always get hung up on is internal family systems.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it doesn't make sense to me. Parts work makes total sense to me, framing it around parts work, but there's something about the internal family system. And I know that that hiccup in my brain, part of it has to do with coming from a very complex trauma background, having a broken family, having a very confused relationship with family in general and a family system in general. But I wonder if you could speak to, like, I always want to, one day when we get to talk to Dick Schwartz about IFS, I like, why that name, and what does it mean? How does it correlate? What's the connection in that space? Because I
Yeah.
always am like, it didn't fit for me, and it doesn't have to, right? I still connect with the
Sure.
work and I still love it, but
Yeah, no, I'm glad you're bringing this up because, yeah, this is something Dick definitely talks about because you're not the only one. You're not the only person that has expressed this of like, I don't really like that name, you know, internal family systems. Why did you name it that? And what I've heard Dick say about it is, he was trained in a family systems therapy model. So there's another model already called family systems. And it's when you're working with families as a therapist. And so he was working with a lot of families in his work as an early therapist. And, in family systems therapy, you're learning, it's basically kind of like parts work ish, but external with actual people. So they weren't saying necessarily like parts, the word parts, or they weren't looking at in terms of managers and firefighters and things like that. But as like a family therapist and family systems therapy, you're looking at a constellation of people within this family unit. And then you're seeing how they interact with each other. You're seeing how, oh, this person turns their back to this person, but this one over here seems more enmeshed and connected with this one over here. Oh, that's interesting. So you're looking at it in terms of these constellations within a family. And so then as Dick was working with these families, he then started to just kind of start to catch on to this language also being used, because he worked a lot with eating disorder patients, and they were using a lot of language of, well, part of me wants to binge, a part of me wants to restrict. And he was like, okay, all right, this is interesting. So instead of looking at this in terms of this external family systems, what if we were to turn inwards and kind of look at it in terms of this internal family systems? And that's, to my knowledge, how kind of that name came to be. But it is interesting because I have had multiple people, including myself, that have had, parts that are like, oh, there's just like this feeling of, and I think it comes from various reasons, of course, connected to past and things like that with the name family. And so I'll get a number of people who contact me, or if I'm presenting about IFS at a conference, they'll raise their hand and be like, so are you a family therapist? I'm like, no, I'm not a family therapist. Then I have to explain, but it can be confusing.
yeah, it always got me, but that makes sense. I mean, that makes total sense, right? And framing it that way, I think, is also really, it makes it really clear where, okay, yeah, that's the system in place that when he was developing the model and coming up with it. And truthfully, it makes total sense, right? Internalizing that process and looking at these different parts of you and how they're all, that's a really unique aspect of it for me. I'm going to spiral. I don't want to get too lost because I want to give a little bit more framework for the people that don't totally grasp what we're talking about before we start diving into, because what I was going to say is like, understanding that it's not just like suddenly I'm embodying a part and now I'm speaking about that part or from that part or asking that part questions, but how much my parts will interact and engage with each other, and kind of like the parts of me that will manipulate the other parts of me, and so on and so forth. And it gets kind of crazy in there, but I know that you work with complex trauma and with anxiety. And so I want to talk about how you have learned over the years to incorporate IFS into that work, and what are some of the benefits that you've seen from being able to do so. Because I do think that, especially when it comes to complex trauma, parts work is something that is so at least for me, it feels so suited to unpacking all of those different aspects of it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Because, you know, when I was trained as a therapist, it was, at least for me, it was this understanding of, do you have trauma or not type of thing. Like when I would meet with someone as a client, you know, do you meet criteria for PTSD, you know, post traumatic stress disorder? And for a lot of people, they wouldn't, but they were still having symptoms that were very distressing to them, like anxiety or suicidal ideation, depression, you know, things like that. But they weren't necessarily able to say, okay, well, here's like a big traumatic event that happened, but it's these the word complex is there because it's complex. Meaning there's, for you know, a lot of people, like I said, there's not going to be maybe like, oh well, I was in a car accident that was really traumatic when I was 10, and then our house burned down when I was 20, you know what I mean? Like some people have those things and they have complex trauma at the same time, where it is this constellation of just many moments, many moments throughout their childhood, adolescence, where it was distressing, it was traumatic, it was hard, it was maybe felt unsafe. And that is then where, from an IFS perspective, you know, our systems, when I say systems, I mean like our system of parts that make up who we are, you know, these systems within us are so resilient and amazing that when we're young and more vulnerable, that, you know, we're having these wounds, you know, these parts within us that are, you know, becoming wounded because of these various complex, traumatic, stressful events. And then we have these protector parts that, you know, take on these roles in order to help the system not feel overwhelmed, you know, by those various wounds, those feelings, those sensations, those beliefs, you know, all of that. And those protector parts then become a big part of who we are and how we live our life. And so, you know, for someone who's experienced complex trauma, there, and I want to say this too, we all have parts. We all have parts. Every single person on this planet has parts. We all have wounded ones. We all have protector parts. And we all have self. Self is that capital S self that is like our innate intelligence, that, you know, mindful observer within. It's, you know, this essence within us, our soul, you know, that has these various qualities of, in IFS, they call them the 8 C's, you know, where you have compassion, curiosity, calmness, clarity, connectedness, things like that. And so, you know, we all have all of that. And for some people who have had complex traumatic experiences throughout their life, you know, they're going to have wounds, and then they're going to have these big protector parts. And I always tell people when they come to me for therapy, you know, the parts that bring us to therapy are the parts that need our help for obvious reasons, because otherwise we're just living our life and we're like, oh, this is fine. So IFS works so beautifully with complex trauma and anxiety, if we're kind of, you know, putting those two together, because it's just helping to bring clarity to what the heck is going on inside, because it can feel very confusing, it can feel chaotic, it can feel overwhelming, because most of the time you're not in those same situations as you were as a child. You're not living maybe in the same state, you're not living in the same house, you're not living with your caregivers, you know, but you're still experiencing this activation in different ways. And then that's where it gets frustrating, because people are like, what the heck is going on? I don't understand. And it's like, well, let's turn inwards and start to unblend meaning shift that perspective from a place of being the part to now being with the part and being able to see it or experience it from this shift in perspective to then be able to befriend them, which is huge and so different than the other types of therapies that I was taught in graduate school, which was more of tell me your symptoms and then we'll come up with ways. I'll give you, as the therapist, like I'll give you these tools and these ways in which we're going to make those symptoms go away. And again, positive intention. And I'm not saying those tools are not useful. I still use a lot of those tools, but now in a different way. I love IFS because it's this way of shifting this perspective from a place of being against it to now moving towards it with that curiosity and compassion. And that curiosity and compassion is that, that ventral state of our nervous system where we're feeling, calm, safe, grounded, to then we can turn towards these parts that have felt overwhelming and confusing.
Natalie, let's get into, because you're sitting here talking about it and describing it. And I'm trying to reconnect with that version of me that I was when I first started kind of working with it and remembering the resistance that I had to it. So if there's somebody out there that's listening and feels that chaos inside, right? Feels that their life is falling apart, feels that they don't know what to do. They don't know how to put the pieces together. They keep repeating the same patterns of toxicity and trouble and chaos and all those kind of different things keep coming up in their life. And they have the desire to start shifting and changing. And maybe they come to work with you. How do you first initially help them identify? Because the part that you just said earlier where, okay, we're starting to identify those parts and then recognizing that there's a part of you that gets to communicate with the other part. Because I know that, like, for me, when I first started working with it, my therapist would play that role where they would be the one that would be kind of speaking to the part, right? And helping flesh out the part and helping to identify the part and learning how to communicate to the part. But what does that process look like for somebody that may not have, they're just beginning and they want help, but they don't really know where to go?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that. Cause it can just feel kind of bizarre at first when you're starting this process of shifting this perspective. Cause again, we're not used to doing that. And so, what you described, it's like what you were saying about your therapist kind of talking to your part. In IFS, we would call that implicit direct access, where it's basically, whereas the therapist, it's kind of like we know that we're talking to a part, but you might not know necessarily in that conscious way yet, of like, oh, this is a part of me that's angry, or this is a part of me that's scared or confused, just because the person might not have that language yet. But as a therapist trained in IFS, it's kind of like we're trained to be part finders and part mappers. So we're listening for certain ways of language and body language and things like that to kind of start to identify like, oh, I'm hearing a part. Oh, I saw them shift a certain way, or they're slumping, or now all of a sudden as they're saying something, I'm seeing their shoulders are like tensing up, or so, we're trained to kind of look out for those shifts, and then we can have this implicit way of then talking to the person, kind of knowing, oh, okay, like this part is present right now within this individual. And then there's another way, which is a lot of fun, called explicit direct access, which is where the therapist knows and the client knows that they're like, you're both talking, like the client is being invited to speak as a part. So it's kind of like acting. And this is where, a therapist might say, oh, so, okay, I'm hearing you talk about this part of yourself that you've been noticing lately that's feeling frustrated about such and such. How would you feel about maybe speaking as that part? And then as the therapist is asking the part questions and the client's answering as the part. It's really fun.
Should we play? Do you want to do it?
Sure.
Okay.
We just wanted to take a moment and hit pause on this episode and thank you so much for listening. We have a goal of reaching over 1 million people and we need your help to do it. If you could take a moment, go to YouTube, search out Steph and Craig and hit subscribe, that would help us a lot. Also, if you shared the podcast, maybe even this episode, that would help us reach our goal. And while you're there, check out all our other episodes and the many, many clips that we have. Again, thank you for your support. Thank you for being here. And we believe that healing is possible when we all do it together. And now back to the episode.
So recently I've had this part that we kind of identified and fleshed out because, again, like we're in the thick of it. And I say the thick of it all the time. I mean, the reality is we do a ton of continual conversations. I mean, we're always processing with each other. We're always kind of like in that space. And we had awareness. This was recent, babe. I don't know, 2 weeks ago, a week ago. That's the other thing is time is so bananas for us. We have no idea when things are happening.
Yeah.
And this part of me recognized, or I recognized a part of me that would call things out, would point things out, would be able to say that thing, you know, unfortunately okay, I got to slow down because this is all brand new, fresh stuff. And I'm tripping up on my words here, but the part is the part that likes to call out things. And I used to use that part every time Stephanie would talk about something or process something or bring up something or even just like regular everyday life where she would come to me and say something about, you know, maybe one of our kids or whatever. And then I would be like, what about that? Or did you see this side of it? Or have you looked at this? Or have you looked at that? Always pointing at things like underneath the surface, always pointing at things that were just outside of the scope of somebody's vision, or maybe like the flip side, or truthfully, it was the side of things that people don't want to look at. So that part of me would always kind of like chime in at inappropriate times, and definitely no boundaries at all. Like, you know, no opting in of like, hey, do you want to actually look and explore what's coming up inside of you? This part would just be like, what's that? So we started to flesh it out and think about it and process it a little bit. And it's one of those things it feels like a fresh new part for me that I'm having awareness of. It feels like this thing that very much wants to be able to call out shit.
Okay.
And like call a spade, like point at things and clearly identify them as whatever it might be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. And is this, I guess, a part that, I guess what I would just kind of invite you to do right now is just take a moment and ask within if other parts of you are okay with you maybe inviting this one to come forward and for you to speak as this part, or if any parts of you have any fears or concerns about that.
Yeah, there's definitely parts that have fear around this part speaking. But I do feel like this part is allowed to speak. Like maybe for the first time recognizing that it, you know, it's like, okay, yeah, this part has stuff to say. We're going to give it its opportunity to be seen and spoken, even though we're afraid of what it's going to say.
Okay. And so the parts that are expressing this fear of maybe what this part maybe has to say, what would help those parts feel more comfortable?
I think it's just the reminder that, you know, the overall reminder that we're safe. There's nothing wrong here. Everything's okay. That those parts are also safe, that no matter what this part points out, no matter what this part speaks to, it doesn't, you know, there's no danger here in this part speaking, even though it might feel like it. So I have this it's that self part that you talk about, or that you talked about earlier. Like for me, it's this higher consciousness self. It's the part of me that's like fully fleshed out as a super idealistic adult that's well balanced and maintained and spiritually connected. It's just my higher version of Craig that exists. That part is like, it's okay, guys. This part gets to speak. Don't worry about it. If something does come up, then. So I think that those parts understand that. They're just a little uneasy, a little nervous, but.
Okay. And so are they okay with you trying this out in this moment right now of
For sure.
speaking as this part. Okay. All right. So
Yeah.
thank them for that. Thank those parts for their willingness to give some space to this.
Right.
And yeah, let me know. Does it feel okay now to kind of shift and kind of blend with this part that calls out stuff, points at stuff? Do you feel the energy of this part present right now to the point where you feel like you can embody this part? And that can be through words, it can be through your body language. It's like we're acting.
Right. And in some ways it does feel like that. What's interesting is before this part feels like safe to be able to, like the part itself, right before it feels safe to be able to kind of come out, there's definitely this part of me that just wants to come through and like caretake and people please. So like first and foremost, it's like, Natalie, definitely didn't bring you on the podcast to do parts work with Craig, right? Definitely totally understanding that like this wasn't the circumventing any sort of different, this is totally organic in a sense. And this is very much, our goal with the podcast and with what we do on the podcast is always to try to show up as ourselves as best as we can, to hold up this big mirror for people. And so it's like, what can we do to show parts of ourselves in this healthy way, in a constructive way that is going to help other people see themselves reflected in what we're doing or what we're sharing or how we're showing up.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the impetus and where we're always kind of coming from. And then it's also like, baby, I love you, of course. And I'm always fucking, we don't like to, it's always like, are you okay? Are you okay, Stephanie? Are you okay? We're like,
I'm so okay.
Continually
I feel
monitoring
very safe.
each other.
I'm really good here.
Okay.
And I'm excited for you to have this opportunity to speak.
Okay.
And I want to say too, that this can go as long as you feel comfortable. So, it could last a minute. It could be however long you feel comfortable with. So yeah, just let me know.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's just it's a good example, I think, of, I don't know. We'll fucking find out what it is. I don't know what it is. Let's find out.
Okay. Yeah. So just take a moment then and invite this part that calls out stuff, that points at stuff, invite this part and all of its energy to kind of blend with you. And like I said, just kind of being present as this part, either with your eyes open or closed. It's whatever feels comfortable to you. And let me know when I am now speaking with this part.
Okay.
All right. So am I now speaking with the part within Craig that calls out stuff?
Yes.
All right. Hi, I'm Natalie.
Hello.
And I would,
Hi.
I'm honored to be able to chat with you if that's okay. And just ask you some questions and get to know you. Is that all right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thanks. So I'm really curious to ask you, what is your job as this part within Craig? What is your job?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what my job is.
Okay. What do you do?
Hide.
Hide?
Yeah.
How do you hide?
I kind of just avoid things. I kind of stay. How do I hide? I hide by not saying things.
So you hide by not saying things. Yeah.
Yes.
And what is your intention for Craig by doing that?
I don't think this part has awareness of Craig.
Okay. So yeah, am I speaking to the part now again, or am I speaking to Craig?
No. Right. I don't think that. because it's asking that part that question, right? And it's like it doesn't have awareness of Craig, but running that question of like, what's the purpose of hiding by not, like, is staying safe.
Mm.
Like that part is protecting itself by not speaking.
Yeah.
But it thinks a lot. I think a lot. Like I'm aware of a lot. I see a lot. I hear a lot. This part feels like it knows a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. So would it feel okay then to take a moment now as Craig, as yourself, to turn towards this part right now and to first notice, how do you feel towards it right now?
Oh, I love this part. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. So let it know then.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm visualizing this part on a playground and I'm just like hanging out with it. And it's almost like it's playing, on the jungle gym or on the swings or whatever. It's just playing and I'm there hanging out with it, protecting it as me, as that higher version of me, that Craig part that goes and sits with these younger parts.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And so how is it being towards you? How is this part on the playground being towards you? Is it aware that you're there with it
Yes. Yeah, it's aware and it's comfortable with me.
right now? Okay.
It feels, I feel like it feels safe with me.
Good. Good. And do you get the sense that this part knows who you are?
Yes, but no, right? I don't think it has the understanding of obviously the totality of who I am, but recognizes me as, I don't think it recognizes me as me,
Okay.
but definitely recognizes me as this guy that shows up and hangs out, if that
Okay.
makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So, and if it feels comfortable to this other part, maybe take a moment and let this part know who you are. Introduce yourself.
Mm. Yeah, he thought it was pretty cool.
Good.
Yeah, he likes that.
Good. Good. Yeah, that's great. And just, yeah, noticing how that feels for him to see you, this like present self, this present self, you being there with him with that love and that care.
Yeah, I think he feels more relaxed. It's almost like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That totally makes sense.
Okay. Good. Good. So that makes sense to him.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Great. Yeah. And does he want to chat with you more right now? Or what feels needed right now?
Oh my goodness, Natalie, this is so freaking hard. It's so hard for me to fully embody that part and speak from that part, but it's almost like the Craig that's hanging out with him there can speak for him, right? It's like that part doesn't feel safe to be heard or to speak, but it feels safe telling Craig things so then
Right.
Craig can relate, right?
Yes. Yeah. And that makes sense. I'll pop out for a second. What you're saying makes sense. And that's, again, just something so beautiful about this experience is not, how do I say that? It's like, not every experience is going to be exactly the same in terms of, the different parts that we're connecting with. So for this part, for example, you first invited an opportunity for this part to blend with you, for you to speak as this part, but then you very quickly realized, oh no, this part isn't really comfortable with this right now. It's not wanting to maybe be heard in that way. And so then the perspective shifted, where then you as your present self were able to then see him. So now that was an unblending, right? Where now he's on the playground, you're able to see him, you were able to, introduce yourself to him. And so now there's this befriending and this connecting that's now starting to happen in that way, which is, one of the goals of IFS is something might start with explicit direct access, which is what we started with here, you speaking as the part. But ultimately, the goal is to get to where you just got, which is from speaking as the part to then shifting at some point to where then you and your present self energy is the one connecting with the part. And so that's great. Because
Baby, I won. I beat therapy.
I was just thinking, I was going to say, you did it. You did it.
You did it. You graduated from therapy.
Right? I nailed IFS, sweetheart.
You did.
You get a
It was
gold
amazing.
star. Yeah.
Yes. I was so excited. I was like, oh, when can I say that? You did it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's listening. It's listening, which is what you were doing. You were listening, and you weren't then getting, a part wasn't coming in forcing something, right? Because that's not helpful either, because then that's not coming from self. That's coming from another part who has an agenda. So if another part came in at some point that was like, no, that's not what we're doing. We are acting as this part. And it's kind of like forcing it to happen. That's not helpful, So you did great of like paying attention to what was happening and what that other part was needing. So good job.
I have a lot of those ones that come in when I do. It's been a while since I've done some actual parts work. But I have those parts that come in. They're like, you're doing this now.
Yeah.
That part that is, mine would catch it all the time. She'd tell me, she's like, ooh, that sounds like another part. I'm like,
Yep. Yeah.
She was really good at saying that.
Yep.
Rather than sitting here and devolving into Craig just trying to communicate with a part of his inner child, because one of the things that I also get hung up on when it comes to parts work or with IFS is I have to take things, like there's a part of me, Natalie, that has to take information in, and then I have to run it through my own filters and almost figure out what parts I resonate with and what I connect with and what I like, and then work with it myself, right? And I used to criticize and judge that immensely, where it's like, well, I'm not doing it like it's supposed to be done. I'm not following these steps. So I'm not really doing the thing. Instead, I'm half-assed doing the thing because I don't have the capacity to do the real thing. And truthfully, I've just realized over the years, it's like, oh no, that's actually a normal thing that all people do, where we take in information through our own filters and then work with it the way that we want to work with it. And I know that there's a lot of terminology around parts work and IFS, and a lot of different, you've got protector parts, you've got all of these different categories and all of these different things. And for me personally, I don't like any of those things. All of that stuff feels like structure and control. And so I do, however, think that it's beneficial to talk about those kind of different, there are, and correct me if I'm wrong, of course, but there are common parts that you'll see pop up in people. And through IFS and everything like that, there's labels to those, and there's categories and things. Could you speak to those?
Yeah. So in traditional IFS, they break it down into, a couple different categories. And so those categories are, there's parts and there's self. So under parts, there's protector parts, and then there's wounded parts. And then there's also parts that are not burdened at all. I want to say that too. It doesn't mean that all of our parts are coming from a burdened place. We have a lot of parts within our system that aren't burdened. They're I don't want to say like they're fine, but like they're doing their thing, and it's not creating a negative impact for us. We might have a part within us that is what we call maybe more managerial. That, like at the beginning of this podcast, right before we started our conversation, there was a list of things that you all wanted to make sure of. That's not coming from a burdened place. It didn't sound like, at least to me, it came from like a managerial part within you both that are both podcast hosts that have been doing this for a long time, knowing, oh, remember, these are some things we got to get through that we need to check on. So if you didn't have that part there within you both, then it may cause some problems doing this podcast, So I want to say that it doesn't mean that all of our parts are wounded or burdened. So we have protector parts, we have wounded parts. Under protector parts, there are technically two categories. There's managers, and then there's firefighters. So the manager protector parts are the ones that, and I love to use this example of driving a bus. So a manager part is at the wheel trying to avoid hitting potholes. So it's trying to be proactive in our life. It's the one driving, being like, nope, we're not doing that. Nope, we're not going there. We're going to do things this way and that way because we are going to do this in order to avoid activating or triggering a wound. But ultimately, we get triggered at some point and we hit a pothole. So our wounded part has been triggered. We're in the pothole. We're feeling the feelings. And then a firefighter protector part then comes in, takes the wheel of the bus, and tries to get us out. The firefighter protector parts try to get us out of the pothole. And so those are more, tend to be more reactive type things that we do. So that's where maybe a part of us comes in that's, once we're already triggered, a part of us might come in being like, okay, well, now we need to go scroll on our phone mindlessly to try and distract and numb. Or maybe a part of me lashes out in anger at my partner. And so that's the way we can kind of look at these protector parts within us, is getting to know these manager ones that are there in our day to day, trying to avoid these potholes, and then getting to know and bringing awareness to the firefighter protectors that get they get activated once we're already triggered. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's how the protectors are looked at. And it's not about I want to say this. It's not about the behavior that makes it a manager or a firefighter. It's about where it falls in the sequence. So meaning, like, let's say alcohol use, for example. Alcohol use doesn't just automatically make a part a firefighter part. It depends on in the sequence of activation. So if someone is drinking alcohol to be proactive against not feeling, let's say, anxiety ever, then that could be a manager. But if someone drinks alcohol, let's say they're already triggered, let's say they go to a social event and they're triggered with like social anxiety, and then they go for the alcohol, then that is a firefighter in that experience, because it's trying to put out the flames of the activation.
What is that? This is all great, by the way. I had two questions. First is, what's the progression? So how do we help identify, would this be a protector part? Would this be a wounded part in relation to kind of the progression of activation? Well, let's go there, and then I'll have a follow-up question. I have a second question.
Yeah. So in IFS, the belief as of now is that, protector parts are the ones that have jobs. There is some debate about that. Because again, I think there's so much stuff going on within our systems. You're going to come across some parts that, if you're connecting with the wounded part might have a job, that it's doing as well. But traditionally, the protector parts are the ones that have taken on these jobs. So like when I ask, someone to ask a part, ask it, what is its job? What is its role? What does it do for you? That's typically where it'll, respond with something like, I criticize, or I make you hide. I make you feel small, or, things like that, where it's like, oh, okay, so they've taken on a job. And then you can ask the question of, okay, so when did you start doing that job? And typically an answer comes forward, and sometimes not, but the answer is usually sometime in the past, where the person, responds with, oh, this part said that it started when I was 12. Okay, well, ask the part why. Why did it have to take on this job at 12? And then that's where you start to get clues as to what it is it's actually protecting / connected to, that's now a wounded, exiled part. So when you ask, like, ask the part, what is its fear? What is its fear or concern if it doesn't do that job for you anymore? And let's say the part, responds with, well, I would be, I would be shamed, I would be judged, and I would, you would feel totally alone. And that is also then a clue of, oh, okay. So it's very fearful of this, most likely this other younger part that already feels that way. That's from the person's past, that it is now protecting, but also protecting the system from feeling, if that makes sense.
It totally makes sense. And it doesn't.
Yeah.
And my brain spins
right
out in it, where it's like, you mentioned exile parts.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to run all the information that you just shared through the filter of the part that we just practiced and went through with me, and trying, I'm like, originally I'm like, oh, that's a protector part, and I'm like, maybe that's a wounded part. And then I'm like, because all of those questions, see, I'm spiraling out in my head. It makes sense though, right, babe?
Yeah, those exiles are intricate, and the way to seeing there, I have a lot of parts of me that I went through that is very much like against the younger parts, very much against that wanting to feel. And like something that's like having awareness is like, I've done a lot of parts work in my life, but I haven't done it for a little while. It's kind of come out, and now what's come into this space and kind of like stirring away a little bit is anxiety. And I'm not doing it, and feeling all this and being in this conversation is taken back, and I see, oh, anxiety somehow has came in and taken over the system in a sense. Or how would I, like, how can I use this with anxiety? How would I be able to, or should we stay on the exile parts? Maybe my exiles were like, hey, look over here. Talk about anxiety. Get off exile.
Well, I'll say this real quick too about exiles, because I use the term exile and wounded parts kind of interchangeably, and I want to name that because that could maybe be confusing. Exiled parts are like the technical term that IFS uses. I find that like I prefer to say wounded, wounded parts, younger parts, vulnerable parts, things like that. And that's a personal preference. I've also had a number of clients, share with me that the word exiled, part sometimes feels, I don't know, maybe kind of activating to them in some way. And that's
scary.
It's scary. Yeah. So I just want to name that it can be exiled parts. It can be wounded parts. But yeah, those are the parts within our system that have, taken on the burden from various experiences, like we talked about before, that were, traumatic, stressful, hard. And we have more exiled, wounded parts in our system that are fairly young. So like from childhood and adolescence, because, we're more vulnerable then. We are really reliant on the care of our caregivers. And if our caregivers are, blended and have a lot of reactivity with their own parts, then from, connected to their own wounds, then that's gonna most likely lead us to having wounds as well, and therefore having these protector parts within our system. And the beautiful thing about IFS is that it's this realization of knowing that we are the ones we've been waiting for. And Dick wrote a book with that title because it's so true, and it's so empowering to really understand that for the first time of like, oh, wow. Like, yes, when I was young, I needed my caregivers. In that external, co-regulation way. And now as an adult, we still need co-regulation with other humans. And we now have more access to that self energy within to be able to be with these younger parts in a way that they really needed back then, but didn't get. So like you, Craig, being with that younger part on the playground, whether it's a wounded exile or a protector, you're there with it. You're there with him, with love and compassion. And that is healing, because for a long time, that part maybe didn't get that either externally or internally, even from other parts that maybe have exiled it away. Or if it's a protector part, other protector parts maybe are like, dude, we don't like you, you know, and that can feel chaotic within, which then can lead to anxiety. So anxiety, I find, can be, there's a couple, we can go into anxiety. There's a number of different things.
I want to go ahead, babe.
I was before I know I'm going to jump in. No, it's my turn. It's my turn. I have to say that self-love and being able to experience any type of self-love, even like whether it's myself now or looking at myself as a child, did not happen before parts work. And I still struggle with the name IFS. I'm glad you went over that earlier, because it puts me in thinking about family, that the integration of that. So it's hard. So parts work for me is how I say it. Parts work is, it feels authentic. I'm talking about self-love, and I'm going to spiral out. But I never experienced that. I remember like very negative self-talk all the time. Like that's how I treated myself. That's how I was treated. That's how I treated myself. And that's how I would self-correct behaviors, was with immense amount of hate, loathing, punishment. And the thought of giving myself love it felt painful. Like it felt excruciating. The thought, I'm like, that doesn't happen. It was disgusting. It was all of these ways that I couldn't bring that in. And through parts work and having the opportunity to somehow have this wonderful person that sat in front of me and helped connect me to these little parts of me, it was like the first time that I felt like I was able to take in love as a kid. Like I was able to like love that part of me, help that part of me. Like you are like who you've been waiting for, save that part of me. It was like I was coming in different levels and experiencing love that I so needed. Could not even admit that I needed that. Didn't even really know that I needed it. Didn't know it was missing, like so far removed from it, to be able to connect to and give that part love that I can still do, that I can still connect to these parts. And finding forgiveness. A lot of times, so much of the wounds and the shame that we have towards ourselves isn't really, I mean, I know there's actions. We've all done things that we regret, that we hold shame over, that until, we can work through. But for me, so much shame that I felt was shame for existing. Shame for what other people told me I should feel bad about myself. Shame for what other things that were done to me that were brought to me. It wasn't even my shame. And so the thought, how could I possibly let love in? And because of parts work, that became something that I got to experience. I get to continue experiencing, growing on, and learning that self energy. I had no idea there was something that actually felt good inside of me, that was calm, that had that. So this has been something that I know, like maybe listening to this, it kind of sounds scary, but this has been such an important part of my journey, being able to have access to this and somebody to help me through it. I remember at first, my therapist was telling me that I can do this on my own. I'm like, no, I can't. I can only do it when you're here with me. I cannot. And it took a long time because I would even forget. I would even forget to try to do it on my own. It wasn't until she was like, okay, let's talk to that part.
Yeah.
Shit, parts work. I have parts. Okay.
Thanks for tuning into this episode. Whether you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any of the other many places where podcasts are available, take a minute and hit that subscribe button. We have a goal of reaching over 1 million people with this podcast, and we need your help. So if you're feeling extra generous, go ahead and leave a review, give us 5 stars, and then share your favorite episode with someone. All of these things help the podcast grow and expand and reach more people, which also helps us get better and better guests so that we can continue to bring you great episodes week after week. Thank you both for listening and just being you. We believe that healing is possible no matter where you're at on your journey, and we all do better when we heal together. Now let's get back to this episode.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that, Steph. That's really beautiful and also very, I mean, just so many people are going to hear that and relate to that. And there's so many things I want to like mention from that. my brain's like, where to start? So yeah, thank you for sharing that, because like I said, a lot of people are going to be able to really resonate with that, that it can feel really weird and hard, or parts of it. You're going to come across parts that like you did. It sounds like that came forward being like, this is gross. This is weird. We're not doing that. We're not giving ourselves love. Ew, and that right there is a part to turn towards, when someone is starting this self-compassionate work of getting to know these parts, is you start with whatever part is then coming forward, and so for someone listening to this and they're like, oh yeah, that would definitely be my experience too, then start with that one. Start with the part that is saying that is gross, that is weird, and just befriend it. Sit with that part, get to know that part, journal with that part, see where that part's coming from. Because like you shared, Steph, it's probably connected to something in the past where it experienced, invalidation or shaming. And it's, if we can connect with that part with a curiosity, and then that turns into a compassion and understanding, then that part is going to feel heard. It's going to feel validated. It's not going to feel shamed, because you're not shaming it. You're turning towards it to better understand. And then that part is going to soften. And then that's going to allow more space, to access more of that self energy to then be with the next part and the next part. And, when I was learning a meditation instruction, a meditation that I really felt drawn towards was the loving kindness, the metta meditation. I don't know if you both are familiar with that one, but it's basically where you, you can envision yourself, and then you send yourself these statements of loving kindness, of like, may you be happy, may you be healthy, may you be calm, may you be filled with loving kindness. And then you can also visualize other people in your life as well as you send them those statements. But I remember, this was before I knew about IFS, and I remember having like, I felt like it was easy for me to like imagine other people and to send them the loving kindness. And then when it was the time to send it to myself, which you technically do first in the meditation traditionally, I never really felt a full understanding or a connection with, like I would tell my clients like, oh, it's self-compassion. But I remember a part of me was like, I don't really understand what that means. I don't really understand how to tell someone to do this. And then when I learned about parts work and IFS, I was like, oh, this is making so much more sense, because it was like, oh, I'm getting to know these different parts within me and connecting with that self energy. And then it was like, okay, yep, I get this now. But I will say for people listening who maybe try this and they come up against, or they find parts, right, that are creating blocks or have a lot of fear about this, that I want to say that that's normal as well. And like I said, turn towards that with patience, and see if it feels safe within to connect with that. And maybe it's you're doing it yourself. Maybe it's finding another healer to help you in that process. But just know that there's no expectation to immediately to be able to connect with the self energy within and send all these parts, all this love, it's okay if that's not happening right away.
Yeah, that part of it takes at least for us, I think it took a really long time to get to the space where I could sit and talk about different parts all day long. But then when it actually came time to like sit with that little part of me, that 7-year-old child that's on the playground, playing, that was very, very challenging. I want to speak, or not speak, but I want to ask you, because I know that you talked earlier about how you're incorporating like the somatic side of things and really bringing that part of healing into your work. For me, we can sit here all day long and talk about all of this stuff, and parts work for me, a lot of it is very much in my head. I'm visualizing things, I'm seeing things. Yes, I'll have emotional responses to some of these things, but how do you, because eventually I just kind of burn out, right? There was always a point when I used to do parts work all the time with my therapist where my brain would just kind of start to get really overwhelmed and taxed because it became almost too much, where it was like this part, this part, this part, this part, this part, you know, and suddenly I just become too overwhelmed with it. And at some point, and I know that Steph relates to this as well, but we had to bring all of our healing out of our head, out of our processing, like in our frontal brain, like all of it had to eventually come down into our body.
Yeah.
And so what are some of the things that you help people with? Because I think that, like, for me personally, I think the next big phase of growth for society, for people on their own little path, is when we do get out of our heads and we get into our bodies, right? When we actually start to allow some of these things to be not just felt, but freed up and moved around in the body.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, it is interesting to notice if there is like a logical, analytical thinking part, because we all have one, but some people have parts like that are really, really strong, and it has served them, you know, in beneficial ways, let's say as a protective mechanism, and then also like in their jobs, let's say. And then when that part takes the helm in parts work, it creates a block. And, you know, it can be this part within that's, again, has a good intention, but it's coming from a part that's trying to think its way cognitively, you know, with these other parts. And that's where, not to say necessarily that's what was happening for either one of you, but I just want to name that can be a part within us that we don't even see as a part.
That was my, like, MO. That was the way that I operated, right? I mean, I could explain everything, I could articulate everything, I could, you know, very clearly identify what my issues were and where all of my, you know, I could talk all day long. I knew exactly what to say and how to say it. And then when it came time to, like, feel, no, I'm
Right.
not interested in the feeling part or the emotion part, right? Those emotions just get in the way of the thinking.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. So then that becomes, it's like, oh, okay. So now we know, oh, here's a part. Now let's turn towards that one, you know, because like I said, that's a big one for a lot of people. And we don't often have that awareness that it's a part until we are invited to have that shift. And then that's where it can be like, oh, whoa, didn't even know, but hello, there you are. And again, befriend it, unblend, befriend, you know, get to know it, and invite it to be there, but to like be off to the side or to stand behind you, you know, so that you can then notice, what does it feel like to be with whatever part then that you are trying to get to know, with that thinking analytical one over here, you know, giving some space. And but in there's a saying, what's in the way is the way, right? So if that's a big part, then turn towards it, because that one's probably going to give you a lot of information and towards healing that it needs, because it's been doing that for some reason. And so we need to get to know it.
I'm like,
go ahead.
Unblend and befriend, or befriend and unblend. Oh my gosh, what was first?
Unblend and befriend.
Unblend and befriend is, I think that's going to be my new mantra. Like, I wrote that, unblend and befriend. And then if it's in the way, it is the way. That's like, if it's in your path, it's for you.
Yeah, one of my favorite ones that, I mean, I
gosh,
consistently
it's
use
like
all the time is, if it's on my path, it's for my path.
Yeah.
Everything that I'm experiencing is specifically there for my experience and for my growth and for my healing and for my path. Yeah. And I love that. Say it again. What is it?
It's what's in the way is the way.
Yes.
What's in the way is the way. And that's like unblend and befriend. I think you just like what I heard, and it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to, what I'm feeling right now, which is resonating, is that is the anxiety. is the complete blending, the chaos, the all of
Yes.
this. And so that unblend and befriend just felt like, oh, like that pull, that somatic, like, oh, that's the way. We're going
That's
to go
right.
that way.
Yeah.
That's, oh,
Well,
unblend and befriend.
yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah. And kind of going back to the somatic question, you know, so traditionally the first question in IFS is, where do you feel or notice this part in or around your body? That's traditionally the first question that we're taught to ask when we're inviting someone to turn towards a part. Because, you know, Dick was, when he was creating this model, he got connected with a wonderful healer. Her name's Susan McConnell. And they were both, I believe, in the Chicago area when he was creating this. And she was already trained in somatics. And so she got really interested in what he was bringing to the table with parts work. So they combined forces. And so she was a big part in, you know, inviting in some of this somatic way of connecting with parts. And so she has a whole training that is amazing called Somatic IFS. She has a book. It's great. And, you know, she
What's her
talks,
name again?
Susan McConnell.
Okay.
She's great. She, in her book, she has this process of looking at, and I might forget a couple, but it's like the first, there's like different layers that she recommends in terms of how to connect somatics and parts work. And the first layer is self-awareness. So bringing awareness to what are you experiencing in the body. And then, and I'm going to get this wrong, but it's like self-awareness. And then I think the next one might be breathing. So noticing, you know, how are you breathing? And then there's next layer is like movement of the body. And then a radical resonance between yourself and another person, and then touch. And so, yeah, she just does it's really cool to read her book and to hear her talks and to take her trainings about ways in which we can connect with parts, not from like a cognitive thinking part, you know, up here. And our body too is all of us. I think we like to think of like our bodies just from like our neck down, but it's also it's all of us, but it's noticing, are we coming from a part that is up here in the brain, that is a thinker, you know, an analyzer, all of that. Noticing that, and then seeing how does it feel safe? What ways in which does it feel safe to bring awareness to the rest of the body? And that's when you're going to get to know parts that are like, nope. You know, if they're like, nope, we're not letting you go there, then start with that part, you know, and see if you can blend, befriend, and see if you can get to know that one. And just, yeah, somatics is just a big piece of this work with ourselves, because we are in this body. And
when you say somatics, can you break that down a little bit for people that might not be familiar with that term or
yeah, so
have heard it before?
somatics is like the body, you know, like sensing the body. And so, you know, when you do like a body scan meditation, it's traditionally, you know, like inviting you to bring awareness to your right foot. And you're not moving technically your right foot. You're not even looking at your right foot, but maybe you have your eyes closed and you're just bringing your awareness to your right foot and just noticing, what do you notice? Is there a block to your right foot? You know, is there a tingling sensation? Can you sense a change in temperature, or does your foot feel cold or warm? And then, you know, in a traditional body scan, then you go to the left foot, and then you go to the right leg, then the left, you know, and you just kind of move your way up your body just to noticing, what do you notice? What do you sense in these different areas of the body? And so in somatic IFS, you're bringing parts into it then, right? So, you know, parts, the belief is like parts live in the mind, but they express themselves through the body.
Oh, I love that.
So parts can be very thinking. So they can, and again, because the brain's part of the body. So they can be up in the brain in terms of thinking parts. They can be a lot of imagery, you know, and the imagination. And then there can also be parts that are experienced very somatically. in the sense of maybe I get tightness in my chest when this part gets activated. Maybe I get back pain in my lower back. Maybe my heart starts racing. Maybe I feel a twitching in my eye. And I'm naming all these things that I have, that parts of me.
For somebody that's very much in that intellectual brain headspace all the time, what's the benefit of them being able to identify the twitch or the tightness in the chest or the pain in my back?
So the benefit would be, because then if you're able to then turn towards that with curiosity and an openness to whatever it might be connected to, then you're actually going to get to know the part that's connected to that sensation, that's connected to that body movement or feeling in the body. Because otherwise, if there's a part that's blocking awareness of any of those things, then you're never going to have an openness in terms of self energy towards that. And then therefore that part that's activating you in that way is just going to keep doing it the rest of your life. And then you're still going to have the negative impacts of whatever it is that it's connected to in the first place. So the benefit is we get to know ourselves and we get to help these parts connected to these things. I'll share an example. And then again, this was before I knew about IFS. I knew nothing about parts work. I was a therapist. I was working at a university as a therapist at the counseling center. I never got back pain. And on this particular day, I had the worst lower back pain on my right side that I had ever had in my life, to the point where I don't know if you all have ever experienced that, but it's like hard to breathe. You can't really sit comfortably. So I was like, all right, this is ridiculous. I'm going to lay on the floor in my office. It was like I had a break in between clients, and I laid down on the ground. I closed my eyes, and I was like, I was trained in meditation at that time. And so in mindfulness. So I was like, I'm going to turn towards this sensation, and I'm just going to breathe with it. And I'm just going to see what happens. And I laid there. I turned towards the pain. I breathed with it. And what came forward in my mind's eye was a memory from my childhood. And it was particularly painful. And I just kind of went with it, and it felt comfortable to do so. I want to say that I didn't force it. It felt okay in my system. I just I was with it, and it did its thing. And I'm not going to sit here and say that my back pain just completely went away, but I'm telling you, it drastically softened after I had that experience. And it was fascinating. That it will always stick with me, because again, I knew nothing about parts work. I knew, I wasn't trained necessarily in somatic therapy at that time yet, but it was there. It was there. So it's can we get curious, connect with that self energy of curiosity and openness to turn towards whatever the sensation is in our body, to just notice what comes forward.
Yeah. Baby, did you have a question? It looked like you were going to ask something.
I'm just resonating. So I'm thinking, man, this is what I've been trying to figure out, what's going on with my neck and my, all of this stuff. That it's so funny, because we get these tools and we know these tools and we've used these tools, but we get to this spiral where we forget. We forget we know them, we forget to use them, we forget to apply them. And it's just, there's so much right now, and I can hear them talking to me in this sense. So I was just really feeling that it's going
I'm
over
so
in my head.
That means that we get to do some parts work,
right?
Baby.
The unblend and befriend. And it's really, I've been sitting here, and I know it's going back, but if it's in the way, it is the way, because I have been just really how am I going to get around this? How am I going to get around this? How do I stop doing this? And just forgot, oh yeah, why don't we lean in here? Why don't we start having a conversation with this? And I'm feeling really great. This whole conversation has been amazing. And it's just that reconnection is coming into that space that okay, it's my belly and chest just opened. You know, I have this
Mm.
breath that I can take. And I'm like, oh, I didn't even realize how tight I was holding until it opened.
Yeah.
So that's what I was feeling in that moment. I didn't have a question. I'm just being in the moment. I'm feeling great.
Natalie, I know that you said, or you mentioned in our email communication, that you're working on a book.
Yeah.
We want to give you an opportunity to talk about it because truthfully, the title of it sounds amazing.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm still working on it, so I don't have a release date yet. But as of right now, the working title is Befriend Your Anxiety. And it's specifically going to be focusing on how to do that with IFS and polyvagal theory. And so, my training before I knew about IFS was I knew so much about the nervous system and polyvagal theory, that was created by Dr. Stephen Porges, and this understanding of we have this parasympathetic, ventral vagal that is our, space within our nervous system where we feel grounded. Now I see it as like when we're connected to self, we're really connecting with that ventral state of our nervous system where we feel that compassion and calmness. And then also knowing our nervous system can then shift into that sympathetic fight or flight state. And then, we also have that dorsal shutdown state. And so I was very much trained in that in terms of like from a psychoeducation perspective, what I would use with my clients who were having anxiety and shutdown and things like that. And then knowing IFS, it's been a game changer for me just personally. I have a history of anxiety, and just what you can do when we combine both of these together is beautiful. And so I'm really excited to be in the process of writing this book. And yeah, I'm excited to be able to share it with the world eventually. I'll let you all know when it's ready to go. And I'd love to send you all a copy.
Oh,
You'll have to come back on the
yes.
podcast.
Yeah,
We would
I would
love
love
that.
that. I would love that. And yeah, it's been a
I cannot
journey.
wait to read this.
It's been a journey, and I've interviewed, as you all have, other authors. And I find that when I interview other authors and I ask them, what did you take away from this writing experience? It's like, this was the deepest form of therapy I've ever had in my life in terms of writing this book. And that's how it's been for me. I mean, it's been a healing journey writing this book, because I'm not writing this from just like a textbook. I'm not doing that. I'm it's very informative, and it's also very sharing. I want to give my life examples with each of these things that I'm talking about. So it's it's activating parts as I am going through this writing process, and that's been a gift.
We heard something recently that if it's in your path, it's for your path, or what is it?
If it's in the way, it is the way.
Right? Yeah.
Right.
Sounds like you've been getting it right. That is a great.
One of the questions, because we have to wrap up, but I definitely want to add, like, one of the things that I've been thinking about this entire interview is dissociation.
Mhm.
Right. I'm leaving my body at some point. And because of my past, because of my childhood, complex trauma, all the different things that I've experienced over my life, only within the last few years have I had real awareness of how frequently I do this, where I will just check out and be gone. And obviously there's varying degrees to it. There's different levels to it. But if you wouldn't mind speaking to, I mean, yes, it's a coping mechanism. Yes, it's how I'm protecting myself. All of those things I think are implicit, maybe, we're always trying to be considerate of the person that's out there listening, because obviously not everybody has our same lived experience or all of those kind of different things. But I guess my question is, how do you work with that in the framework of IFS? Because I'm trying to think about it through that lens of like the part of me that will dissociate. It's almost like dissociation itself is a protector, where it's like, here we go. We're going to come in and implement this thing and just swoop in and pick you up, and we're fucking out of here. We're leaving because this situation is no longer safe.
Yeah, well, you're right. It's from an IFS perspective, it's looking at dissociation as a part. And so, I would invite the person that I'm working with to bring awareness to what that feels like when it's happening. because again, it can be happening without our awareness. It's there and we're like checked out, but we're like not consciously aware that that's what's happening until maybe after the fact. And so, it can be an invitation, like if you're working with a therapist or a healer who's trained in some form of this, part IFS or some other parts work, they, again, we're trained as part finders. And so again, we're going to be looking at like changes in the person's like body language, what their eyes do, um, how their tone of voice changes. And so it might be that you need someone else sometimes to have an invitation to bring awareness to it. I want to say that too, that sometimes this stuff is just really blended and we just aren't having that conscious awareness on our own of it. And that's where having someone there observing us can be really helpful. So, but yeah, in IFS sense, when I invite, for me as well, having, a part that would, have me dissociate. And you're right, it's at varying degrees and levels. When I was a kid, I used to faint, so it was very, ooh, and now, as I gotten older, it's more of like, I can feel like a wash kind of come over me where like, I can just kind of feel my eyesight just kind of go like off to the side. And then that's my cue of like, oh, here's my dissociation. And then that right there is a level of unblending when you're bringing awareness to it, because it's still happening, but now you're aware of it. And then that then gives you the opportunity to then turn towards it, if that feels safe to the rest of your parts, to then be able to befriend it and to better understand, why is it doing that? When did it start doing that? Is it aware of how old you are now? And that maybe you're not in the same situations as you were in the past? Because maybe it's not. And, if you can befriend, it's just like with anxiety and depression, all of these things, it's like, if we can befriend this stuff within ourselves instead of it coming from other parts that are frustrated or fearful or mad or shaming, it's like, it's a whole nother world of, these parts can still be there. And most likely they're not going to be as intense because they feel seen, they feel heard, they feel connected to you. They're not being, polarized with other parts that don't like them. So that's where you feel, like you were saying, Steph, like that openness, in your belly and in your chest, and just like this settling in of like, we can all be here and that's okay. But yeah, dissociation, it's a state. So like you can look at it as like, it's a nervous system state, maybe like within the dorsal shutdown, where it's connected to that. And then this is where you combine like polyvagal and IFS together. So it's like you bring awareness to, maybe when you're going into dorsal, you have dissociation. And then is that connected to a part? So that's where there's power in bringing awareness to knowing what you experience in each of those nervous system states, to then bring connection to the parts that are maybe attached to those things.
Natalie, we're going to have you come back and do a whole another episode on the nervous system and polyvagal theory and the blending of all of it. So
I love talking about it. So yeah, I'd be happy to.
The whole nervous system aspect of healing, or just even just not even healing, just awareness of what your nervous system is doing, that feels like the edge of our growth right now, where we processed things intellectually for a really long time. And then we started to get into our bodies and started to be able to feel our emotions and started to be able to connect with the pain or the belly or the back or things like that. And now it's like, I'm trying to, and I say we, because I know that Steph's on a similar path, but really trying to hone in on the uniqueness of like, because my nervous system will react first. It's like my nervous, at least it feels that way, right? Where my nervous system will respond to whatever's happening in my brain outside of my body, externally. My nervous system is almost always the very first line of defense, I guess, right? Or the first reactionary part of me. And the sooner I can catch my nervous system's response, then the sooner I can be cognitive of what's actually taking place. Is this something that is warranted in the moment because I am needing to fight, flight, freeze, I'm needing a response? Or is this probably something that's in my head or in my heart or in my body or in my emotions or something?
Yeah. And
So it feels like a leading edge for me right now is trying to really unpack and understand all the things that shape and mold. Because, see, here we go. We're going to talk a little bit more about it. But for me, I recognize that there are so many unconscious things that I have just like fuck all awareness about when it comes to what actually affects my nervous system.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that I feel like it's almost like operating completely autonomously. And I'm trying to learn how to tap in and watch it and participate with it, and then learn how to work with it as opposed to just being at the mercy of whatever's happening.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that's a big part of what I'm writing in my book is, that the way I'm looking at this is that there's kind of two different ways the way I'm looking at it in terms of how we get triggered with anxiety, particularly anxiety. And that is our nervous system can activate the psychology. So like the nervous system can get activated first, which then impacts like triggers our parts. And then it can be the other way too, where our parts, our psychology is impacting and triggering our nervous system. So, and so that's where it can be empowering to get curious and get to know for yourself as an individual what each of those things feels like. And because, like, I'll give you a quick example. Like for me, an example of my nervous system impacting my parts was, I was pregnant with my son and I was having gestational diabetes that I wasn't aware of at first. And so my blood sugar was all over the place. And when that's happening, I was having these hypoglycemic episodes where my blood sugar dropped, and then my body was releasing cortisol and adrenaline to counteract that. And so then my nervous system was getting into a fight or flight state. And then that was triggering parts of me that had fear about that state of activation of panic. And then my parts start telling stories. I'm stuck in that fear. And then it's just like, oh, it was awful. So that's an example for me where it was like my nervous system was getting activated by like a biological thing first, which then activated my parts. And then the other way would be like, let's say, a part of me is worrying about feeling, I'll give a real life example. So I was about to do, I think, an interview on my podcast with someone, and I started feeling chest tightness. This was before the interview started. And so I noticed like the fight or flight state first. But then when I paused and turned inside, because I was like, what's going on here? I noticed that actually there was a part within me that was saying things like, this is going to be awful. You're going to screw up. You're going to, this person's going to judge you. They're going to reject you. And then there's like abandonment stuff getting triggered there, right? Which is then triggering the nervous system to be like, danger, danger, flight, 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 run away, anxiety. So that's where I feel like this can be, again, really empowering to get curious about our systems, both the nervous system and our part system, to really start to understand how is it working for us, especially in regards to anxiety. But yeah, so the nervous system stuff is typically what we're going to notice first because we feel it, where, yeah, it might be the racing heart rate or the aggression or the shutting down, the dissociation. But it's like, oh, and then what are the parts connected to it as well?
Natalie, thank you so much. This has just been amazing. What is the easiest way for people to find you, follow you? You said your podcast. Tell us the name of the podcast again.
Yeah, my podcast is called That Wellness Podcast with Natalie Deering, IFS with a twist. You can find it on Apple, Spotify, all the things. And then you can go to my website. That's ndwellnessservices.com. And you can sign up for the newsletter. You can find the podcast on there. And I'm on Instagram at Natalie Deering.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both
This
so
has been
much.
super wonderful. You'll definitely have to come back when the book's out.
Yeah.
And before we wrap, we end every episode with our tagline is expect the best and plan for the greatest. Would you mind giving it for us?
Expect the best and plan for the greatest.
Wonderful.
Thank
And we'll see everybody. I always say next week, but we'll see everybody on the next episode, whenever that is for you, right? There'll definitely be episodes next week. I'm all nervous now. Let's end the podcast.
We will see you
Bye.
soon. Bye.
Bye.
We got a wild ride. Wait and see, you and me. We were meant to be.
We want to make something perfectly clear. This podcast is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only. It is not intended to be used as a substitute for professional advice. We're sharing with you our own personal experiences and insights, things we have found to be helpful on our healing journey. But we are not licensed therapists. If you need help, it's important to seek out a qualified professional. Remember, we believe that we all do better when we heal together. See you soon.